Okay, welcome everyone. This is going to be the last class on understanding the names of God. This will be the end of our mini series. The next 2 weeks, we actually, there is a part that actually continues with the name of God, but we're going to dedicate 2 classes to Pesach. And not just Pesach, because this whole series is fundamentals of Kabbalah and Hasidut. So we want to see in the holiday of Pesach and the way we observe it, the different customs, the different halachas, the different understandings, different fundamental principles of Kabbalah and Hasidut. So that will be the next 2 weeks. So for those who have been following the series from the beginning, I said that we were following the teachings of Rav Ginsburg as how he gave over about the names of God in his book, What You Need to Know About Kabbalah. And we said in the beginning that we're going to approach it in 4 sections. The first section was understanding the 4-letter essential name of God. The second was the sanctified names of God, and especially how they correspond to the Sfirot. And today we're going to do the last 2, which are called connotations, meaning the way we refer to God. They're not names of God, but in Jewish custom, in the Midrash, in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, different ways that we relate to God and we call him. And these are really his attributes. And then the last one are a very unique way to see how every word in the Torah, in a sense, is a manifestation of a name of God. So those are the 2 we're going to do tonight, connotations and understanding, in essence, the entire text of the Torah. So we're going to start with just a few examples. These are not all the examples, but we're going to deal with some of them. I mentioned last week that in the Talmud, of all the ways that we refer to God, the one that's used the most is referring to God with the name Rakhmana. Rakhmana comes from the word rachamim, compassion. And we're told that this is actually, of all of the attributes that we might want to relate to God, that the one that is most related to the 4-letter name of God is compassion. So for those who were here last week, we connected the 4-letter name of God to Tiferet, to the sphere of Tiferet, whose inner dynamic is compassion, rachamim. So in the Gemara, when they want to refer to God, today we're very used to saying Hashem. That's how we refer to God. We're not saying God's name, but we say Hashem, the name. In the Talmud, you don't really see that, but you see Rakhmana. So that's one example of a connotation. It's not a name of God, but it's an attribute that we so closely associate with God that it's a way we refer to God. Another example that many people know is Hamakom, the place. And where this comes up the most is when you go to pay a shiva call, a visit to someone who's sitting in mourning. And so the traditional phrase to say, Hamakom yinachem etchem b'toch sharei avlei Tzion v'Yerushalayim, that Hamakom, the place, should have compassion on you among all of the mourners of Zion and all of Israel. So that's what this is most commonly referred to as hamakom. So where does this come from? We might have learned this already. Review is always good. One of the things we're going to really focus on tonight are the 13 midot of rachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion. I'll explain that when we get there. But this is what God revealed to Moshe after the golden calf, when Moshe was praying for forgiveness for the people. And when God when God grants the Moshe's request, he reveals what are called the 13 midot of rachamim. And we're going to learn about them in a few minutes. But as part of that, God tells Moshe, you can't see my face and live. No one can see my face and live. You can see, as it were, my behind, but you can't see my face. And so then it says, the Torah says that God hid him in a cliff of the rock and said, I will pass before you and I will enunciate these 13 midot of rachamim. And in the Torah it says, God says, there is a place with me. There is a place with me. And the term is hamakom. So Rashi says, he brings a very paradoxical statement. Says, who, meaning God, hu hamakom shel olam, v'ha'olam einu makomo. He is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. So this is a very typical paradoxical statement. He is the place, hamakom, of the world, but the world is not his place, meaning God created space. But if you try, and he fills every point of space, but that is not the whole picture of the essence of God. In a certain sense, that's the immanent nature of God. The transcendent nature of God is not of this world. So that's what the statement means. He is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. So that's the source of referring to God as hamakom. So, and maybe I'll be able to share this on the WhatsApp, but it's given over in Kabbalah that if you take the 4 letters of God's name, a yud and a hey and a vav and a hey, and you take their numerical values and you multiply the numerical value of each letter by itself. So yud equals 10. So 10 squared, 10 times 10 equals 100. 5, hey equals 5. 5 squared equals 25. Vav squared equals 36. And the second hey squared, 5, is 25. So 125 and 36 and 25 equals 186, which equals hamakom, the place. So this is a very deep understanding. How do we get to this term hamakom? Is by multiplying, because in Kabbalah we're told that any number that's squared, it's its completion. So this is just a very beautiful understanding. And another understanding is that less people are aware of, and the Arizal brings this down, especially in relationship to shaking lulav. And if anyone remembers, I think it's from, I guess his name was Uncle Moshe. He had a song, God is here, God is there, God is truly everywhere, up, down, all around. That was Uncle Moshe. So a whole generation of kids grew up on this song. But this is really the kavanah of shaking lulav, because we're shaking in all the directions. He's here, there, he's everywhere. He's up, down, and all around. And so the Arieh says that, and we're going to see in a minute in the 13 Midot of Rachamim, one of the names of God we learned was an Aleph and a Lamed. The name El, or we refer to it as Kale. This name equals 31. If you imagine God being in all 6 vortexes of space, so there's 6, height, width, and breadth. So 31 times 6 equals 186 equals Hamakom, the place. This is brought down from the Arizal. He said this is one of the kavanas. Maybe this is where Uncle Moshe got it. But that's how we shake Lula. We're shaking to the 6 directions. And the Arieh said to have this name in mind because it will help us realize that God is truly everywhere. Another way we refer to God, especially in our days, is Ribono Shel Olam, or in English, Master of the World. Ribono Shel Olam. Again, this is not a name of God, but this is one of the ways that we refer to God. In the Talmud, they had a similar term, which was Alufo Shel Olam. Now, in modern Hebrew, an aluf is a general. Like the head of the army is the one who has 5, called falafels, 5 stars. That's the head of the army. But he's called an aluf. So in the Talmud, God is referred to as Alufo Shel Olam, which really means the master of the world. So again, that's another what we'll call connotation. I didn't have a chance. I saw someone put in Yiddish, it's Eibishter. Many people refer to God as Eibishter. I have virtually no Yiddish, but I believe it means like our Father in heaven. I believe that's the translation. If anyone knows better, please put it in the chat and we'll get to it. But that is actually another term, Avinu Malkeinu. It's one of the very important prayers that we have. Our Father, our King. And many times we refer to God as our Father, Avinu, our Father. So these are a few examples of connotations. Now I'm going to share the screen. There we go. So here, what we're looking at are the 13 midot of Rachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion as written in the book of Exodus and Shemot, as I explained, as part of the forgiveness process. And this has become a very, very important prayer at different times of the year. Especially during the month of Elul, the slichot, the special prayers that we say during the month of Elul, the cardinal prayer of slichot are these 13 midot of Rachamim. So in other words, they're not just a list of attributes, they're a way that we elicit God's compassion. It's a prayer. We've made it into a prayer. I'm going to explain a little bit more of that later. So we're not going to delve into this in great depth because we have a lot of things that we want to get through tonight. But what I wanted to show you is a very, very beautiful connection to the 13 aspects of the Sfirot. I know that many of you were here for our series on the Sfirot. And of course, we learned the importance of 10 Sfirot, but we also learned that there's another way of looking at the Sfirot that Rav Ginsburg is especially known for teaching. And that is because the Zohar teaches that there are three aspects of Keter. There are three aspects up here. If you see my cursor, this is Keter up here. And there are three aspects of Keter. This is given over in the Zohar, and the Arizal explained it in great depth. And when you count Keter and Dot, then you have 13 aspects. So obviously, it's an incredible correspondence between the 13 midot of Rachamim and the 13 expanded aspects of the Sfirot. Now, what we're looking at here is what I'll call the standard way that we break down the 13 midot of Rachamim. But I will mention, because some people might know this, and I want to make sure that everyone is included here. The Arizal actually counts it different than we see here. Here, we see that the two names of God, the two four-letter names of God, in the traditional way of counting the 13 midot of Rachamim are the first two. Whereas the Arizal, for reasons that he explains, he begins his count with the third name of God here. And what he does, if you look in knowledge, in Dot, he separates between these two words of Erech Apayim, between patience and God's countenance. And he does the same thing here in keeps acts of loving kindness for thousands of generations. He turns this into two. Notzer Chesed is one aspect of compassion, and to thousands is a separate one. But what we're looking at is the standard way, and the connections are very neat and fit absolutely beautifully. I'm not going to go into great depth, but it begins with the two essential names of God. And there are many reasons for this, but in a printed Chumash, by tradition, there's actually a line. It does not appear in the Torah, but there's a line called a pasik between the first name of God and the second name of God. And so some explain that the first name of God is the transcendent aspect of God, and the second name is the immanent aspect of God. Others explain it very beautifully that the first name of God is God's compassion before a person would sin. God has compassion on all of his creation. And the second, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is the compassion that God shows even after someone has done wrong and made a mistake, that God still shows compassion. That's the whole point of the 13 midot of Rachamim, because we had made the golden calf. And there was a tremendous tshuva that needed to be accomplished. So those are the first two names. And then the third is also a name of God. This is the one that equals 31, and to the 6 directions, the name Aleph and Lamed. And so here we see very neatly in the three aspects of Keter are three names of God. Each one has an aspect of compassion and loving kindness that is slightly different than the other. Now, in Chachma and Bina, which we're told are like two beloveds who never part, throughout our prayers, we put together these two words, Rachum v'Chanun, which means merciful and gracious. In many, many different prayers, they go together. They're like a pair, Rachum v'Chanun. So that fits beautifully in Chachma and Bina. And here, again, I'm not going to go tremendously deep into each one of these, but in the level of dat is called erech, which means patience. Here in chesed is an obvious one because chesed means loving kindness. And in the 13 minute of Rachamim, it's Barav Chesed. God has great loving kindness. In Gevura, it's and truth. Because truth is like a judgment. Something is, if it's true, then it's yashar, it's straight, it's clear, and it's like the laws of nature. They're dependable, they're emet. Tiferet is that God keeps loving kindness for thousands of generations. And then in the last four, it's all about forgiveness. In other words, from the beginning through Tiferet, it's the emphasis here is that God is a loving, kind, merciful God. And the last four talk about after a person has sinned, that God bears iniquity, that's nosei avon, and pesha, and he bears transgression, and he bears sin. These are three different types of sin based on if they're on purpose, if they're by carelessness, if they're by accident, if they're unconscious. And the fourth one is in Malchut, because this is the power of a king. In kingdom is the king has the power to absolve. V'nakeh literally means to cleanse. That a king has the right to absolve someone's sentence, or if someone is in jail, to free them. And even today, in governments around the world, the president or the prime minister, depending on the country, has that right. So here, this is probably the most concentrated and focused list, as it were, of God's attributes in the entire Torah. And as I mentioned, we have turned this into a very important prayer in the month of Elul, Rosh Hashanah, especially Yom Kippur. And for some people, actually, in the prayer that's called Tachanun, which is also a prayer for forgiveness, we say this almost on a daily level. So that was the 13 midot of Rachamim. Okay, so now I want to get to another group of connotations, and that's in the Amita, in the silent prayer that we say 3 times a day. And I'm not going to go through all of them because there are many ways that we refer to God. We say in the first blessing, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. The great the strong one, the Gibor, and the awesome one. Again, these are not names of God, but these are ways that we relate to God. We can have a relationship through the greatness of God, the might of God, and the awesomeness of God. And then at the end, the third blessing of the Amida ends, Baruch atah Hashem hakel hakadosh, the holy God. And so this brings us back to another very, very well-known connotation is Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. Because holiness is an attribute that we relate to. that we associate with God. And one of the mitzvahs of the Torah is to emulate God. And so in Parshat Kedoshim, it says, God says to the Jewish people, you shall be holy, for I, your God, am holy. So here, this is in the Torah itself, where just like we learned in the 13 Midot of Rachamim, this is God, in a sense, speaking of himself, revealing to the people, these are my attributes. These are the ways you can come to know me, by emulating me. So that's why it says in the Talmud, it says, just like God is Rachum, is merciful, so you shall be merciful. Just as God is gracious, you shall be gracious. This is one of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, is to emulate God. And so how do we emulate God if we don't have any concept of the attributes of God? So that's what we're really learning about tonight. And we are not by any means going through all of the attributes, but we are definitely touching on some of the main ones. So this last one, the third blessing of the Amita, is the holy God, the God of holiness. And therefore, that's one of the ways that we emulate God. Now, we're going to close the section about connotations with a very, very interesting philosophical debate. And the centerpiece of this debate is Maimonides, is the Ramban. And the Ramban was known to encourage and advocate with an attitude of shlila in relationship to understanding God. What the Ramban was saying is, whatever attribute we can think of in human terms, we should not think of God this way, because that's limiting God. So and this is very a part of like how to meditate. So the Rambam's attitude about the attributes of God are that even though everything we just learned and all of the different connotations, including in the Torah itself, this idea of God, the great, the mighty, and the awesome is in the Torah. It's in the book of Devarim. So these are in the Torah itself. So, but nonetheless, the Rambam wanted to teach that if you really want to understand the essence of God, you have to like clear your mind of any human concept of an attribute that you might want to, as it were, pin on God. So he would say is, if you think of God as being full of chesed, full of loving kindness, so in a sense, you have to go beyond that. You have to understand that whatever the Torah means by God being Rav Chesed, it's not exactly the way we think of it. So this was, the Rambam is very, very known for this. And this is a type of meditation where it's almost like in Purim, we learned about Ad Lo Yada. And the expression, the greatest knowledge is to know that I don't know. So that's really what the Rambam was saying. The Rambam was saying God is so transcendent that if we really want to get close or envision his essence, we have to clear our mind of any human attribute. Now, everyone does not agree with the Rambam for the simple reason because these attributes are in the Torah itself. Some of the connotations are from later, like Alufo Shel Olam, the master of the world, or Hakadosh Baruch Hu. These have come down by different rabbis, different mystics, different sages, but the Torah itself talks about God's attributes. So many people do not agree with the Ramban because it's, I can't remember who stated it this way. He said, by not that the Rambam is wrong. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. The Rambam was saying something very deep and very correct. But many, many people feel that if you take it to the extreme, then it's like you have nothing to hold on to. And the word is sanitize. If you sanitize God of like anything you can think about, well, it makes it very difficult to relate to God. So we do relate to God as being gracious and merciful and loving and holy and all of the things that we mentioned tonight. Okay, now for our last section, this is a very, very intriguing idea, is the Ramban in the introduction to his commentary on the Torah, one of the most important of all commentaries on the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses. In his introduction, he says there's a way of understanding that the entire Torah is one name of God. So that's like, whoa, what does he mean? What does he mean that the whole Torah is one name of God? So Rav Ginsburg, in the book that I've been following the way that he presents the different names of God and the different connotations, etc., is that nothing can exist without a spark of God animating it. Everything in the world, from mineral to vegetable to animal to human. When I mean mineral, we're talking about tens of billions of galaxies. So everything, every atom, every cell, nothing can exist without, we call it the permission, without the life force, without the spark animating it from God. So in a sense, that's how we can understand what the Ramban meant. Because we say all the time that the Torah is the expressed will of God, of the Creator. And so actually I'm going to add one. This is a very, very important one. One of the connotations that I didn't mention is when we relate to God as the one who gave us the Torah. So an expression that is used in the Talmud is mipi hagevura, from the mouth of gevura, one of the sfirot, from the mouth of might. So why was this one chosen? Of all the ways we could relate to God as the giver of the Torah, from the mouth of gevura. So it's explained that the Torah is highly condensed. Like we talk about the tzimtzum. Here we're talking about the will of an infinite creator being contracted into letters that then reflect God's will and God's wisdom. This, from, as it were, from God's side, this takes enormous tzimtzum to be able to take infinite light and wisdom and to condense them into the letters of the Torah. So that's what it means, mipi hagevura, from the mouth of might, because as it were, it took God's gevura to be able to do this kind of condensation into the letters of the Torah. So coming back to this idea that every word in the Torah, in a sense, is part of what we'll call an expanded name of God. So one of the things that I've mentioned before is that in the Zohar, when it relates to the different verses in the Torah, almost always will translate it into sfirot. In other words, there's a certain energy animating a verse or a story or a name or a place in the Torah. And the Zohar, which is obviously on a very, very high level, was able to translate virtually everything in the Torah into manifestations of the Sfirot. Now, the Arizal did a very, very similar thing with the names of God. And he did it through gematria, through numerology, where the Arieh was able to look at a verse, and by analyzing the numerical values, and there are many, many different types of gematria. It's not just each letter has a numerical value. We already mentioned the idea of squaring numbers. There's many, many types of gematria. For those who are following the 70 Faces series, we're going to get to 20 of the 70 chapters are about numbers in the Torah. Numbers are so important. The Arieh was able to analyze not just the Torah, but also the prayers. And he found names of God all over the place, but they're hidden. You have to be on the level of the Arieh. Okay, Baruch Hashem, he revealed them. And these are what are called the kavanot of the Arieh for prayer, as he was able to take, for example, the Amita, and reveal that in all the words of the Amida are ways of seeing different names of God. And that's what we learned last week. You would say, well, what's the importance of knowing the difference between the names of God? Because each name of God represents a different energy and is used in the Torah in a different way. So all of this is just to explain this concept of the Ramban, that the entire Torah is like one name of God. That sounds very theoretic, but what I'm trying to say is that the Zohar, in its way, revealed the whole structure of the Sphira, which of course are connected to the different names of God. That's what we learned last week, how each name of God is connected to one of the Sphirot. And the Arieh, now there are others also, but the Arieh was famous for revealing names of God hidden in the text. Now, I mentioned before the idea of the 13 midot rachamim. We've turned it into a prayer. When it doesn't say in the Torah per se, God says, I'm going to teach you a prayer. But it's understood that the reason that God revealed the 13 midot rachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion, was so that people could use them to elicit God's mercy. And to elicit means to pray for, to speak, to express ourselves to God in prayer. And so Rabbi Nachman of Breslov had a very important concept. He said, you should turn your Torah into tefillah. He made this a general statement, not necessarily about the 13 midot rachamim. A general statement is each person should turn their Torah into prayer. So what did he mean by this? And this is an incredibly important, fundamental concept of Chassidut. Is what he was teaching was that anything that we learn is when we're done learning it, we should realize that we want to connect to whatever we learned in a very, very, very deep way. And we do that through prayer. So whether we're learning the portion of the week, or we're learning about the holidays, or we're learning about the laws of Pesach. Just one second. Okay. That whatever we're learning should not just remain up here, this theoretic or even a practical idea. We need to pray that we can fulfill this, that we can integrate this, that we can make it part of our lives, that we could share it with others. And it becomes a prayer. So I heard a Torah from Reb Shlomo Carlebach, and he said like this: when God said to Adam, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So we're told that Adam went to Chava and said, this is what God said. We can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So Reb Shlomo said like this, he said, what Adam didn't understand is that the way he gave it over, it was like a fact. It was like dry. He needed to have prayed that he and Chava would be able to fulfill that. And he didn't give that over, not to himself and not to Chava. It was just like, this is what God said. But if he would have prayed over it, and he would have given it over to Chava in a way of a prayer, that we should have the strength to fulfill this mitzvah, it might have turned out different. And that's what Rabbi Nachman was saying. He was saying, like, take your Torah and turn it into tefillah. Make it a living part of your desire to come close to God, to come close to the Torah, come close to your own soul, to integrate whatever you're learning, and it should be really part of your life, not just like an intellectual exercise, or even learning about what to do, but as an obligation, without it like really touching the depths of your soul. So based on this, we could invert it and say that we should take our tefillah and turn it into Torah. Now, what does that mean? So many people learn how to pray, but never necessarily learn the depths of the prayers. In other words, this is how you pray, when you pray, where you pray, how long you should pray, how you should stand when you pray. But what do the prayers actually mean? In other words, studying the prayers like you would study the Chumash. To just like every year, we go back to the same Torah portions over and over again, and we try to learn something new about them, something deeper, some new revelation. But how many of us do that with our prayers? We pray and we memorize it, and sometimes it touches it. Many times we're going through the motions. So just like we have to turn our Torah into prayer, also we have to turn our prayer into Torah. We have to like learn the depths of prayer to make it meaningful for ourselves. Now, just a few more things is that and we all already mentioned this in a way. We know that there are 4 different basic levels of learning the Torah: Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. The literal meaning, the alluded to, the hinted to meaning, then the drush, the metaphorical meaning, the parable, the symbolism, the allegory of the Torah. And then, of course, there's the Sod, the mystical, spiritual underpinnings of the Torah. And so I mentioned about the Arizal, who is able to see names of God all over the Torah. And so, and we've also learned there's different alphabets. Again, for those who are following 70 Faces, we learn Atbash, Atbach, different. You could read the Torah completely differently. And then we know that in the book of Exodus, there are 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters. And a tradition is handed down that out of these 3 verses come 72 3-letter names of God. Here's another example of what the Ramban meant when he said the whole Torah is like one name of God. But this is a particular one where out of 3 verses comes 72 3-letter names of God. And then there's what's called the 42-letter name of God that is engraved in the prayer Ana B'Koach. But many people say that it's also like encoded in the first 42 letters of the Torah, that this 42-letter name of God. And then there are other deep Kabbalistic secrets about different names of God. One example, it's not with the Chumash, but in the Megillah that we just read on Purim. So we're told that any time it says HaMelech, the king, it's in the storyline, it appears that it's talking about King Achashverosh. And sometimes it says Melech Achashverosh, and sometimes it just says HaMelech. And we're told anytime it says HaMelech, the king, it's talking about the King of Kings. So here's another example. It's just the king, but we're told that it's actually referring to God. And we also saw that in the Megillah, that the name of God, we learned this in this class a few weeks ago, that the letters of Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey appear as acronyms in a number of places in the Megillah. Well, it's the same thing in the Chumash. There are different acronyms, and we learned that in the first verse of the Torah. One of the most secretive names of God is an acronym for Et Hashemayim, the Et Haaretz. That God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we learned that there's a 4-letter name of God hidden in the acronyms of those 4 words, Et Hashemayim, the Et Haaretz. So these are just examples trying to show what did the Ramban mean. But we're going to go back to the simplest of ideas in a certain way, and that's what Rav Ginsburg said, is that since the Torah is the revealed will of God, and since nothing can exist without being animated by God, so that is the key to being able to understand everything in the Torah is like an attribute, is part of God's great revelation, God's great name. So this is a great way to end our mini series on understanding the names of God. Did we do everything that we could have? Of course not. But hopefully in the, I lost track, 4 or 5 classes, we were able to give people a taste and a foundation of understanding the different names of God, the different attributes of God. And my blessing to all of us is that we're able to take these teachings and do exactly like Rabbi Nachman said, is to turn our Torah into tefillah. That we should take everything we learned about the names of God and then approach God and pour out our hearts out, how much we want to be close to God, how much we want to understand our own lives, what's happening in the world. We want to understand the Torah. We want to understand Hashem. We want to understand. I'm going to end with one more thing. And this is a little bit in the way of thinking of the Rambam. There's a phrase, im yedativ hayitiv. If I knew him, I would be him. Meaning, obviously, we're not God. we have a spark of God, but we're not God. So since I can't know him, I can't be him. So the Rebbe Rashab said like this. He said, when I go into a room by myself and I'm reading Torah or from the Alter Rebbe, sometimes I can get to the place where I can say, Yadativ Hayitiv. I can know him and I can be him. But it doesn't mean I can be him. It means that since we have our souls are a spark of God, Chelak Elokah Mima'al Mamash, an actual part of God above, so there is a way that we can come to know him completely, absolutely, not exactly. But what the Rabbi Rashab was saying, there are those moments of clarity. There are moments of clarity where we can, what's called devekut, we can cling to God. So I want to bless all of us to be able to turn our Torah into tefillah and ultimately to know God the most that we can as finite human beings.